My name's Ryan Young. I'm the coordinator for the Technical Assistance and Research Center here at the National Council of Urban Indian Health. Again, thanks for joining us today for this Executive Community of Learning webinar, Board Building Strategies and Structures to Recruit, Orient, and Engage New Board Members. All lines are currently muted. However, if you wish to ask a question, we ask that you write them into the Q&A pod that's in the lower right of your screen, and we'll provide time for your questions to be answered at the end of the presentation. This Executive Committee of Learning webinar is tailored for those in leadership positions and those that hire and manage frontline staff, and by providing you with relevant information and practical tips, NCUI aims to support you in being successful. Today's presenter is Tony Scucci, and Tony is a licensed social worker, and he's a certified board governance trainer with over 20 years experience offering outcome-oriented approach to building organizational capacity in nonprofits and community-based organizations through consultation, training, and coaching. And his client list includes several UIHPs as well as other Native organizations in Indian country. I'm going to pass things over to you now, Tony. Thank you for leading this training today.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that introduction. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I want to thank Ryan and Alexandra in particular for helping get this set up and for all the technical support and all the behind-the-scenes support. So thank you again. I appreciate that. As we go through the presentation today, we'll welcome your questions anytime. You can type them into the chat box. If a lot of questions come in, Ryan is going to help kind of consolidate and compile them. And Ryan, I would just invite you to please interject questions when it seems appropriate or fitting. And one of the other things I just want to mention up front is that we are evaluating all these different webinars. So at the end of the webinar, you're going to get a link to an evaluation form. And I just want to encourage everyone to please take the time and give us your feedback and also suggest ideas for future webinar topics. We're very open to hearing that. Our goal here is to continue to improve the way we provide these services. So having said that, let me just back up a minute and put this big the heading of the webinar up here. And I just want to talk about for a minute, the emphasis of the webinar. I'm going to look at recruitment, orientation, and engagement of new board members, but the real focus is going to be around engagement. We want to be clear that when you're asking a new board member to come on the board, that you give them something to do, and that something has to be something that really has meaning for them, something that's important for the organization. So the whole webinar is based on engaging people by giving them meaningful responsibilities, giving them support to kind of carry out those responsibilities, and then folks will feel like they're really making a difference. And that's the key to all of this, people feeling like they're making a difference when they show up and when they do the work, when they come to your board meetings. So we're going to look at strengthening the board through three different aspects. One is around recruiting, and to do that recruitment strategically. And then we'll follow that with orientation, and we'll spend some time looking at how to orient folks, and so I'll share with you some ideas for how you might do that. And then to purposely engage people. And again, as I said, performance problems almost always underscored by a board member not feeling a real sense of purpose. When board members feel a real sense of purpose, they'll show up. They'll come to meetings. They'll roll up their sleeves. They'll do the heavy lifting. They are people who already care a lot about the mission and about your organization. They simply need some direction around what it is that you're asking them to contribute. How will they make a real difference? My sense, too, with a lot of effective board members that I see, they tend to be those folks who are busy people. And if you look around, or if you know of people who are very busy, you'll know that they're not just busy doing anything. They're busy doing things that really feel purposeful for them. So the theme throughout the whole webinar will be around finding ways to connect board members and give them a real sense of purpose, that they are really doing something to advance the mission of your organization. The next slide is kind of a overall picture of the cycle in which we think about building boards And as you'll see with the highlighted in red parts to this, we're going to look at recruitment, we'll move then to orientation, and then to involvement. And I'll say about orientation that one of the things you'll want to do with orientation is once you've recruited a new board member and you bring them on the board, getting them oriented to the organization and to the board, the sooner the better. And we'll talk some more about ways in which you can do that. But it's really important when somebody new comes on the board that they get into it right away. I have had many experiences where board members would say to me things like, I've been on the board for 2 years and I'm still getting my feet wet. And if you think about that as an example, if somebody's been on your board for 2 years and they're still getting their feet wet, think of all the value they're not contributing and think about how they may feel about how they're being valued. The other thing I want to say about recruitment that I think is important, 2 points. One is that when you're recruiting board members, it's really important to be honest with them. If your organization is going through some struggles, some kind of financial problems, whatever it may be, being honest is really important. You want to be right up front with people, and what you'll find, I think, is that when you are up front with people with the particular challenges your organization has, there are some people who will rise to the occasion. They'll see that as a way for them to make a difference. And for others, they simply won't come onto your board. So being honest about the situation that your organization is in is really important. And the second guiding principle around this is to not underplay the commitment. For someone to come on your board and be effective and make a difference, it's going to take some time and some energy. And if you're having a hard time recruiting folks, very often the tendency is to say, oh, we'd like you to come on our board. It won't take very much time. And once you start doing that, you set yourself up for a failure. Be really open and honest about the situation of your organization and that it is going to take a time commitment. But the other side of that equation is that commitment of time is going to make a difference. When I think about people coming onto a board, I think about the different kinds of capital or kinds of value, different ways in which they can bring value to your board and to your organization. And so this is a breakdown of like kind of 4 categories. And I like to use this as a way of thinking about how to recruit people and what it is that you're looking for in new board members. It goes beyond the simple individual role. It really looks at ways in which somebody can bring value that doesn't fit into a neat little box necessarily. So you're not saying, well, we need a lawyer or we need a medical doctor, or you're saying we need somebody who can bring some intellectual capital or someone who can bring resources to our organization. And I just want to quickly kind of share with you a little bit of definitions around what these things are, some examples. So that when you think about intellect or intellectual capital, the example that comes to my mind all the time is a lawyer that I interviewed who was serving on a board of directors. And he'd been on the board for a couple of years. And I asked him, so how did he come onto the board? And he said, initially, I came on because they were looking for a lawyer and they knew I was a lawyer. And I said, okay, well, in the past 2 years, have you contributed as a lawyer? And he paused for a minute, and then he realized he hadn't done anything in terms of his specific role as a lawyer. And as he thought about it more, what he came to realize is the way he brings value is that he has this particular skill where after the board is discussing a complex issue for 15 or 20 minutes, they look to him, and he distills it down into its 2 or 3 essential points. So he has that kind of skill, and those are skills that are kind of lawyer-like skills. Lawyers tend to have those kind of basic skills. So he's bringing value, not necessarily as a lawyer, but somebody who thinks like a lawyer, is trained like a lawyer. And that's an important kind of example of intellectual capital in a board meeting. It's the way you get from that big roundabout conversation down to, okay, what are the essential points here that we have to look at? Resources is another kind of capital, and that's not just bringing on someone onto your board who maybe is philanthropic and has a lot of money to give. Resources could also mean other ways in which a person can bring things that will benefit your organization. An example: I worked with a client in Southern California several years ago, and they had a board member who was very powerful businessman in the community, and he had a large company, and he actually let the organization use an entire floor of his office building. And not only did he provide space, he provided all the technical, the phones, the internet stuff. He provided all that. And that was a way he saw himself as being purposeful as a board member and helping to advance the mission. Reputation is something that really matters, or credibility might be another way to think about this. If your organization can recruit somebody to the board who is very well known and very well respected in the community, that's all to the good, because you get, when somebody is that credible and they come on your board, your organization becomes more credible. And the other upside to that is that when you bring on folks who are perceived as real leaders in a community, that generates interest in other people who are similar, people who are those kind of high caliber board members. They will come onto a board when they see that there are those kind of community leaders on the board already. And the fourth way to think about it is access. For some board members, the real value they bring is that they can open doors for you. They can connect you to key partners in the community. They can connect you to decision makers in your state capital or in the federal system, people who can open doors for you. And that's particularly important, I think, in this day and age, and with the changes that are going on in our country and national politics. Having access is really important to make sure that your organization is safe. So those are like ways to think about recruiting and the kind of values, the kind of capital you can look for in bringing people onto your board. The next couple of slides come from a woman named Jan Masaoka, and she talks about what she calls critical path recruitment. And she talks about boards in baseball, and she compares them. And they're both team sports. And incidentally, one thing I like to point out all the time is that the only team you'll ever serve on where you don't get to practice is a board. All other teams get to practice. With board, you come in and you start playing the game. So she compares boards and baseball, and both of them are team sports. When it comes to baseball, some things everybody does. Everybody wears the same uniform. Everybody attends practices. Some things only one or two people have to do. Not everybody gets to play shortstop, and not everybody is going to be a warm-up pitcher in the bullpen. So there are things that everyone does, and there are things that are more specialized. And when you recruiting people in terms of a critical path recruitment, you want to think about those things. So again, boards in baseball, in terms of boards, some things everybody has to do. Everybody has to show up. In some organizations, every board member has to make a contribution. These are things that are specific, that are general to everyone on the board. And then there are also some things that are really specific. Not everyone on your board has to have an in-depth understanding of financial, nonprofit finances, but some people do. Not everybody has to be a good bridge builder, but you need to have some good bridge builders. So as you think about this, think about the general things that everybody's expected to do, and then the things that are more specialized. And as I think about folks and talk about when you begin recruiting, you typically begin with the question, who do we know? And what Jan Masaoka suggests is that there's a better question to begin with. Rather than ask the question, who do we know, begin with the question, what are the two most important things the board needs to accomplish this year? What are those really important things, those actions that have to happen, those initiatives that have to be advanced? What are those one or two or three most important things that we need to do as a board? And in your recruitment process, you recruit somebody to that, to those specific tasks. So to kind of summarize that, she talks about starting where your priorities are as an organization, establishing objectives for the board, and then you base your recruitment on those objectives. What are the things that you're really asking people to do? And then approaching people with a concrete role to play. You're giving them a job to do right up front. And if you think about bringing people on a board, it is very similar to hiring somebody into a position. The parallels are very striking. One of the things we set out to do here was to ask a polling question, and I think this would be a good time to ask it, and I hope it's this question. Here it is. So here's a question I'd like you to consider and respond to, if you would, and we'll get a sense of where people are. The question is, does your organization have a written board job description? That is, something that specifies the expectations of board service, something that lays out the duties and responsibilities of board service. So please take a minute and respond to that. I'll give folks like 5 or 10 seconds to respond. Do you have something that you would consider a job description for board members? Well, it looks like just about everybody on this line does, so that's really a good thing. I appreciate you clicking on that. It gives us a sense of who's here. My sense and my experience is that with job description, it always makes the work easier, because when you're asking somebody to come onto the board and you're asking them to take on a responsibility, you're asking them to take on a job. And I think that's just really key to things. Another thing that some folks do, in addition to or in place of a job description, is they have some kind of agreement or a contract where new board members would sign off every year what it is that they're expected to do and what they can expect from the board. So you have job descriptions. I think that's really great. I would encourage you to use them and make them an important part of the recruitment and orientation process, because you're actually, in fact, bringing people onto a board to do work. This slide here is my best attempt at drawing an iceberg. So, as you'll see in a minute, but I want to talk a minute about the parallels between hiring somebody to a position in your organization or recruiting somebody to serve on the board of directors. And so if you imagine this as an iceberg, there are certain things that we know about somebody in the interview process or in the screening process very quickly. We know what they know. We know what skills they have. We know what their experience is. It is really the tip of this iceberg, and we get that information very quickly. What we don't get quickly and what we have to dig for is how they see themselves and what their motivation is and what are their personal traits. And it's these things below the surface that form the largest part of the iceberg. And these are the things where you have your deal breakers. So if anyone on this webinar has been in a position where you've hired and fired people, I would bet you would agree with me that whenever you have to fire somebody, it's not because they don't know how to do the job or they don't have the skills. It's because they have certain kind of qualities that just don't work. Somebody who is dishonest or unethical, somebody who is not a team player. These are the below surface issues, and these are almost always the deal breakers. You can train somebody if they're motivated and smart. You can train them to do almost anything, but you can't train someone to be honest. You can't train someone to be a team player. Either they tend to be that or they don't. So as you think about recruiting people, I'm encouraging you to think about transferring those skills you have in hiring to the work of recruiting board members. I'm going to shift for a minute now and move on to board orientation. In the next 3 slides, I'll really lay out these 3 parts to orientation. Phase 1 is the getting to know you part. Phase 2 is the assessing fit phase, and phase 3 is the actual onboarding or orientation part of the process. So as you think about board orientation, there's really 3 parts to this, from recruitment to orientation: getting to know the person, and for the person to get to know you and your organization, getting a sense of whether they're going to be a good fit, and the onboarding itself, bringing them onto the board. And what I want to do with you in the next couple of slides is to share with you a sample of the steps of a process that I use on the board that I currently serve on. And I think this is a good example to kind of cover all the bases. So as you'll see, the form we use is set up. There are certain steps, and then there's a purpose behind each step. And so looking at this phase number 1, this is the phase where you're just getting to know somebody. It's when you have your initial contact. It may be somebody approached a board member and said they'd like to be considered for board service. It may be that your board, through your governance committee, decided, oh, we should go out and recruit someone. It's the initial conversations you have, and the purpose behind them is simply to get a sense of who this person is. Why have they chosen you for consideration, for example? Or why would they want to serve on this particular board? You might want to share with them why you serve on the particular board that you're on. And you're looking for board experience. So this is the purpose behind the getting to know you phase in the first section here. Based on that getting to know you, based on getting to know each other, that would logically lead then to the next step, which might be to encourage a person to go to the website, share some various links with the person, some general kind of information, and the goal there, or the purpose, is simply to continue getting to know each other. You then move on to this phase, and in this organization, the governance chair, and GC is governance committee, but the governance committee chair would meet with the prospective board member. That might include the executive director as well, it might not, but it's a more extensive conversation. So if you think about it, the person is getting closer and closer to your organization. And in those conversations, the purpose would be to make sure that you're communicating what the values are of your organization, maybe a little bit about your history, a little bit about your personal perspective on things, and so you start discussing what is it would be expected of a person coming onto your board. From that, if it seems justified and warranted, you move on to following conversations, sharing more information, for example, the job description, your bylaws, those kind of documents. So now, as you see, you're moving into a phase where the knowledge about the organization and the prospective board member starts to deepen. And you start getting a better understanding of your organization and how it operates. At some point, you want the executive director to sit down with a new board member or a prospective board member. And that, again, is to get to know each other because they're going to be working in a relationship, but also to provide more of the kind of detailed information about programs and services that the executive director is probably most fitted for doing. You may include other members of a governance committee in interviews with the prospective board member. And then the governance chair may have yet another meeting with the prospective board member. So this is the getting to know you phase from the organization in which I serve on a board. And as you'll see, this takes some time, but we've committed to making an upfront investment in the early stages here. The goal is not to close a deal. The goal is to get a sense of whether this is a good fit and whether we are both making a well-informed decision. The second step phase has to do with assessing the fit. And again, this is about trying to get a sense of whether this person will fit into your organization in terms of their style and their culture, their respect for culture. You really want to start getting, if you're thinking about the iceberg analogy, you really want to start getting at what's below the surface there. Who is this person I'm sitting with? What is their real motivation for coming on this board? Are they somebody who can fit into the culture? Are they somebody who can work in the ways that we work? And from that, then, the candidate's information would eventually go onto the board for board action. And that takes us to this slide, which is then the onboarding itself. So once you have the person on the board is formally acted to have them seated, one of the things that we do is we assign a mentor. So we ask a current board member to connect up with this new member and to meet with that person one or two times, perhaps, have a phone call before the board meeting. It's a way to just start building relationships and to talk and to bring people into your boardroom in a way that they can get in and up to speed as quickly as possible. And then again, the CEO continues to meet with the new board member because there's a lot you need to learn as a board member. And then what we do is we then have an actual orientation session. It's a 1-hour training we do with some PowerPoint slides, which really lays out some of the specifics about our organization. And the purpose of that is to kind of make sure that the board member knows what the duties and responsibilities are of board service and that they have a deeper understanding of the organization. So those are the three phases, the process that I use in the organization on the board on which I sit. And I share it with you all because I think it generally may have some application for the urban Indian health organizations as well. So we gone from getting to know you to assessing the fit to the orientation. The next slide will focus a little bit on orientation, actually these next two slides. So this slide here, we're looking at orienting a new person to the board, to the organization. And as you think about orientation, your new board member has to be oriented to the organization and to the board, and those really are two distinct things. So when we're looking at orienting a person to the organization, they have to get a better sense of what are the programs and services, who does what, who does the organization serve, what difference is your organization making, and some ways in which you do that is have a new person tour your facility. Participate in a program activity, for example. Introducing a client to a client by a staff person, a virtual tour, going through your website. These are ways in which you can help a new board member get more grounded in the organization. In terms of finances, which is another area of orientation, basic information for a new board member. Where's the money coming from? How's it spent? What's our financial position? What's our financial health right now? And you can do that by just a small presentation by the chief executive or a finance person, sharing background information. These are ways in which you can help a new board member get grounded more quickly in the financial aspects of your organization. History, I think, is critical. Helping people better understand the history of your organization. You didn't just come out of nowhere. The whole history of urban Indian health is a fascinating history, and then where your organization fits into that. And you do that by having some folks share some stories, different written materials. I've worked with some nonprofits where someone on the board actually would spend some time and write up a brief history in a summary form, 3 or 4 page history, just as a way to not lose your history, to make sure that you capture it and you can pass it on to new people. The strategic direction, if you have a strategic plan, that's a great tool to share with the new person so they have an idea of where you're going, what the priorities are. And then in terms of the organizational structure, we want to help a new person really understand who does what in the organization. An organizational chart is a good tool for doing that. And introducing a new board member to some of your key staff people. So this is an example that kind of covers all the bases around helping a new person get oriented to your organization. Now at the same time, you have work to do around orienting the new board member to the board itself. And that has to do with helping the person better understand the board roles, so they really know what this board does for this organization. And that might be in some written materials, it might be a presentation of some kind. Board member responsibilities. This is the whole idea of a job description. I use here a job description or a signed agreement, a way to make it clear that this is what the responsibility you have coming onto our board. How the board operates. Did you get a sense of how does this board do its work? And this is an area where having a mentor really helps, because a mentor can be sitting with a new board member in a meeting and really just have little side conversations they need to get a feel for what's going on. Board portal is another way if your website, if you have a board portal, it's a great way to archive all the important organizational documents, minutes from meetings, your bylaws, etc., and they can be in one place where new board members can access them at their convenience and get themselves up to speed. A board manual is kind of the old-fashioned way of using a board portal, but if you're in that developmental area, that's fine as well. A manual where the key organizational documents are housed. Having an annual calendar is another way to help understand the operations. And then listing is if you've got your committees listed with their charges and who's the chair and who the members are, these are tools that you probably have already. Putting them together in a packet of some kind or posting them in your board portal is a way to make sure that new board members get up to speed quickly. And getting them connected to each other. Having a list of who is on the board, a little biographical data on each board member, having time at your board meetings for some kind of social interaction. These are ways in which people can get oriented and up to speed quickly. And I would encourage everyone to do the orientation on a real fast-track basis, because the sooner that a new person gets in and up to speed, the sooner they can start bringing value, and the sooner they will feel valued. And as I said earlier, that is the key to engagement. I walk through a couple steps around engagement, and then I'm going to share an example with you. So if you're looking at really engaging a board member, you begin with determining what's the strategic priority. What is it that you're going to ask this person to do? You assess your current board capacity. Is there anyone on our board who can do this? And you may determine that there isn't. Then you would identify somebody who's a prospective board member who might have that particular skill set or the particular connections or particular talent or gifts that you're looking for. And then you assign some responsibility. That's the incentive. You actually give somebody the job of taking lead responsibility for something that's meaningful. They will feel a sense of purpose, and from that all, engagement will flow. So again, if you think about it in these stages, you start with what is a priority? Do we have the capacity to address that? And if we don't, who do we find that does? Let's give them the job. They will feel a sense of purpose, and they will engage. The next slide is a slide I'll put up here, and it's my feeble attempt at being creative with the slide PowerPoint, but this is a slide I want to use to walk you through an example of when I think about strategic recruitment and meaningful engagement for board members. So you begin up here on this top right where you have a strategic priority. So let's say that you've identified that one of the things you need as an organization that's going to be most important to you in the next couple of years is to raise your visibility in the community. That there are many people that have no idea who you are and what you do and why it matters. And so you identify that as a priority. And one of the ways that's a priority is because when you raise your visibility, you're going to increase more traffic. Your patients are good. You're going to have more patients. You may attract other funding sources. You may attract some key partners. So getting the word out, who you are, is really one of the priorities. So if that's your priority, then you determine, okay, well, let's look around the board table. And is there anybody around the board table who has any kind of skills or competencies around public relations or marketing or branding? Is there anybody who's connected to a company or an organization that does that kind of stuff? And you determine, okay, we don't have that. We don't have anyone who has that capacity. So now you've identified a priority and you identified a gap. The next thing you do is you go out and you start looking for a prospective board member. And so you approach somebody in the community who is really well known for marketing and for branding and getting names of organizations to be household, to be household names. And you approach them and you don't just simply say, we'd like you to serve on our board. You're saying to them, we'd like you to advance one of our strategic priorities. You're giving them a job to do that's meaningful, it's important, and that fits with their skill set. And from that, you give them the responsibility to take it on. We would like for you to make our organization much more visible over the next couple of years using your skills and your connections, working with other board members on our staff to get us to that point. And when you've done that, you now have somebody who's fully engaged. They have a clear sense of what their job is. They have a clear sense that it makes a difference and it's important. They have the skills to do it and the support to do it. They can do it. By the time that person's term ends and it's time for them to cycle off, they can cycle off your board feeling like they were engaged, they made a difference that had a lasting impact. So it's an example of strategic recruitment that leads ultimately to somebody really fully engaging in the work of the organization and bringing the particular talent and skill sets that they have to bear on making the organization a better organization. And if you do have questions, by the way, please type them in, or we can get to them in the end, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm going to move along to another slide, and these are just some tips that I've come across that reinforce some of what we've been discussing. So there's 6 tips here. And this font is a little bit small, so I hope you can see it okay. But one is the whole thing around communicating, staying in touch with new board members, keeping them connected, reaching out to them between board meetings. Communication in a really intentional way is a good thing to do. Investing in morale. Hosting an annual retreat will be a great way to build more of a community bond within the board. And building morale on the board is really important. It's how you bring your group of people together to become a team. Making a difference. Again, you want to, from time to time, review the accomplishments of your board and the organization based on board actions and tie the organization's successes to the actual work that the board did. If you had a capital campaign and you were successful, you want to tie that to the work that the board did in helping to make that successful, in addition to all the other people who were involved. Another tip has to do with relationships, cultivating relationships between board members. This is like critical. When boards have problems, they tend to not be technical, they tend to be relational. Most organizational problems tend to be relational, and that's often the result of not attending to relationships. So being conscious and being real intentional about relationships. How do we work more effectively together? That's why the idea of a mentor really works well, taking time at board meetings for people to actually get to know each other. And when people know each other and feel more comfortable with each other, they're more likely to be who they really are. They'll be more likely to ask questions and to engage. So attending to relationships is just very fundamental. And then engagement, getting people involved in a regular way, highlighting organizational successes. Telling stories and sharing stories is a way to engage people because it inspires people. Telling stories about your organization, about how it's affected people in personal ways is what it's all about, tying the mission to real people in the real world. So those are some tips. Oh, and the last one, find and develop talents. Board members, you find as you get to know people, you get to learn they have all kinds of talents, they have all kinds of connections that you may not know unless you start spending some time and having conversations. So those are some tips to kind of keep in mind to kind of, I hope, underscore a lot of what we've been talking about here. I want to talk a little bit about a structure and structure that will support the process. And keep in mind that process is what really matters the most. Structure supports the process, and it's really the only way that works. So I want to start with some definitions to just be clear about what we're talking about. So, we're starting at the top with the board of directors, and obviously that's the governing body of the organization, and that's where ultimate authority comes from. It comes from the board of directors. The board is ultimately responsible for the steering and controlling and influencing the direction of your organization. Now, you typically have some board committees, and standing board committees are almost always comprised of board members. They have some governing responsibilities, and they may also have some authority that's delegated to them by the board. And the nature of the responsibilities tend to be ongoing. That's why we use the term standing. So an example of a standing board committee might be a finance committee. It's comprised almost exclusively of board members. It does have some governing responsibilities in developing budgets, for example, and the board may delegate some authority to a finance committee as well. It may ask the committee to make certain decisions on behalf of the board. For example, it may ask the committee to decide who will audit the books. So that's an example of what a standing board committee is. Continuing with definitions, there's ad hoc board committees or task forces, and they're the same as the above. An example of that might be a review of your bylaws. You don't need to have an ongoing group of people doing that. You need to bring a team of people together, a task force of folks who can look at your bylaws, review them, revise them, make sure they're up to date and they're workable, and the job is done. And then the idea of a task force, which I think is a good way to think about voluntarily involving volunteers in your work, not necessarily connected to the board or to governing. So a typical example of a task force might be a fundraising event where you bring people together to help raise some money. And then there's the notion of an advisory board. So this is a voluntary group of individuals that have specialized skills or service expertise or perspective. Many of the urban programs have youth advisory groups, so they want to be in touch with young people to hear what's going on in their lives and what they need in terms of health care. May be something that's ongoing, it may not be. It doesn't have any governing responsibilities at all. So those are the kind of structures that we put in place here. And the way I like to differentiate between committees that are board committees and all the other committees you may have is that board committees support the work of the board. All other committees support the work of the organization. So if you go back to those examples, a finance committee supports the work of the board. It helps the board to oversee finances. Whereas a youth advisory task force, that's a group that supports the work of the organization. It helps the organization ensure that it's in touch with young people, with young patients, bringing them into meaningful ways as providers and as receivers of services. And when I think of all these different committees or task forces, a framework that I always use in establishing one or revisiting one is what I'm putting up on the chart here. And you always begin with the charge. What is the charge? Who is the chairperson? Who is the person that has lead responsibility? What's the best membership? If we comprise this, if we take, for example, the youth task force, the charge might be to help the board be better in touch with how young people think and what their needs are. Who would be the best chair? You would identify a board member who has a particular interest or skills around that, and you would ask them to chair it. You would invite people to serve on that membership, so you would clearly have young people on that group. It may require some staffing support. It may not. You may decide we're going to invite some young people for a couple of meetings, or you may decide, we're going to meet with them every quarter in an ongoing way. And then what are the accountabilities? How are we going to know that we're doing what we set out to do in terms of the charge? All this is a way to think about framing the way you divide the responsibilities of a board and an organization down into smaller parts. And again, it always begins with starting with the charge. And in some ways you can think about this, it's the job description. What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to accomplish? And everything will flow from that. I want to talk for a few minutes with this slide as we come closer to the end of this webinar about a governance committee. And I'm going to share with you a governance committee that I serve on, and this is the job description for a governance committee. And the governance committee really has the lead responsibility for attending to the board's growth and the board's development. So where you have a finance committee, which primary responsibility is around finances, governance committee, it's around how are we working as a governing body, how do we make sure our board continues to learn and to grow, how do we make sure that we have board leadership that's planful and intentional, how do we evaluate our performance as a board of directors. So this here would be an example of what you would see in a job description, in a sense, for a governance committee. So one of its responsibilities is to assess the needs of the organization. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Where are our gaps? And that's simply the idea of saying, let's stop for a minute and let's put a mirror up in front of us and let's look at and see what we see in this mirror. What do we do well as a board? What are areas we don't do well where we need to improve? And then how do we get there? So in a way, assessing our needs as a board is one of the most important things a governance committee can do. Assessing the way in which the board works on a regular basis. Taking time at the end of each board meeting to actually evaluate our board meeting. How did we do in this meeting? Did we accomplish what we set out to? What could we do to make this meeting more interesting or meaningful for board members? Those are the kind of evaluative questions that you would look to a governance committee to ask. Ensuring that leadership is developed in a real intentional way. Many times, and this may be true for some of you all in your programs, many times when I ask a board chair, how'd you get to be a chair, their response is often, well, no one else wanted the job, or I got it by default. It's not a good way to be good stewards for an organization. Your board, you want a committee that's in place for whom this is one of their major responsibilities, to continue looking at who will be our future leaders. As we recruit people onto our board, who are these people that are going to emerge as leaders for our board? Governance committee recommends a slate of directors and officers. This is kind of what you would think about as your kind of conventional nominating committee. And what a governance committee does, and as you'll see this and you'll see more, is that it expands on this really basic one responsibility of a nominating committee and expands more to be a committee that in an ongoing way is paying attention to the board. Making recommendations for vacancies would be another typical kind of job responsibility of a governance committee. And then the key one here that has to do with this webinar and it fits into this context is to ensure that you have a process in place where you can identify, cultivate, recruit, orient, train, and engage new board members. When you have a governance committee in place, and this is one of its responsibilities, it's a way to make sure that you're paying attention to it and that there are some accountabilities for it. and ensuring that the board has the right mix of folks in terms of perspective and diversity, what you need on this board to be effective. A mix of people who can come together with different ideas and viewpoints and actually come together and deliberate and have dialogue and come to consensus and make reasonable compromises around big decisions for your organization. That doesn't happen by accident. To bring together that kind of mix of people requires real intention. And the last bullet point on this is to ensure that your organizational documents or tools are reviewed on a regular basis. It's a good idea, perhaps every 2 or 3 years, to first have someone take a look at your bylaws, for example, your policies and procedures. How do we look at these things and make sure they're updated and they're practical and they're working for us? So this is an example of what you would kind of charge a governance committee with doing. And this really covers all the bases as you look at it. It looks at what we do well and what we don't do well. It looks at how we develop leadership. It makes sure that we have directors and officers in place. It makes sure that when there's vacancies, we fill them with good people, and that we have a good vetting process, and that we have a good process to get people in and up to speed and engage as quickly as possible. That's kind of the basics of what I would look at when I look at a governance committee, and I think if we're looking at trying to increase board member engagement, the key to it all is to make sure that every board member, and especially new board members, come onto your board with a real sense of purpose, with some specific task or responsibility that really matters, that they're going to advance with the support of the rest of the board and the organization. And that when you do that and people feel a real sense of purpose, they will roll up their sleeves, they'll do the heavy lifting, they'll get the job done, even if they're very busy people, because they are people who are engaged in something that makes a difference for them. So I come to the end of the presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat box. I do want to leave a few minutes. If you do have some questions, please take a minute or two to reflect on what we've been talking about. I know one of the common questions that people ask if the webinar, if these slides are available, and they are or will be available to everyone. They'll be archived at the NCUI website, and you can access them once they're there at your convenience. I know that a lot of urban programs, board members will use some of the different webinar topics and use some of these slides in their own board meetings as part of their board training. So be thinking about that. If you have questions that you'd like to share now, if you have no questions or comments and you have some after this webinar is over, my email address is here, and I would encourage anyone who would like to know more information or have any questions that this is the best way to reach me at this email, and I will respond within 24 hours. I always do. If I don't respond within 24 hours, that means I didn't get your email, but I would be glad to share anything I have with you or help you find resources. I'm really very much in the business of trying to help you all be successful in advancing your missions. Don't see any questions at this point, so I think I will turn it back over to Ryan. And Ryan, maybe you make a comment about the evaluation and anything else you'd like to say to wrap up, please.
Thanks, Tony, for providing all this great information today. Again, those presentation slides are currently available for download. There's that pod right next to the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. The webinar has also been recorded, and it's going to be archived on the NCUI website shortly. And again, if there's any questions, feel free to type them in now. And as we wait for people to do that, I'd like to invite everyone to participate in a survey that'll provide us feedback on today's presentation. And that's over there in the participant chat box on the lower left of your screen. And if you've registered for this webinar, you'll receive the slides via email following the webinar, along with that evaluation link. We do have a question here.
Yep.
Discuss term limits of members is what I have.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for the question. Let me say this about term limits, that term limits is something that many nonprofits have in place, and the reason they do is that it's a mechanism for renewal. It's a way to ensure that people can come on the board, they know that they're committing for a certain period of time and that they're going to cycle off. And what it does is then free up space for new people to come on. One of the challenges for boards, and one of the realities of boards, is that they are dynamic and they are not static, so they're always kind of, people are coming and going. And one of the big challenges of nonprofit boards is to attract young people to serve on boards. And you can't bring people on unless you have some vacancies. So term limits basically is a way of ensuring that people can come on the board, they know how long they're committed, they cycle off at the end of their terms, and they create space for another person to come in. The term limits are very common and very highly regarded in the nonprofit world. Term limits do come into conflict culturally with a lot of Native organizations, because from a cultural perspective, in Native culture, when you have somebody on your board who's an elder, for example, why would you ever want the elder to get off? There's such a value in that person's perspective and wisdom. These are issues that individual urban program boards grapple with all the time. And the work is to strike a balance between having the wisdom and historical perspective of elders and balancing that with creating open space and openings for new people, for young people in particular, to make sure that that you're hearing new perspectives. As much value as a veteran board member may have, one of the things that they cannot bring to your board meetings is newness. A new board member can bring newness. They may not know much in terms of depth and understanding and wisdom as new board members, but they certainly can bring newness, and you want to strike a balance between those two. And thank you again for that question. Other questions?
Again, please take a few moments to complete our survey. That link is in the participant chat box on the lower left of your screen. Well, I don't see any more questions. Again, if something comes up, feel free to email Tony at that email that's listed on that slide there. And again, if you've registered for this webinar, you'll receive those slides and the evaluation link via email. So I'd like to thank all our participants today. I'd like to thank Tony for all the great information, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, everyone.